For centuries, sailors around the Cape of Good Hope have spoken in hushed tones of a ship that defies reason, a vessel appearing suddenly, its tattered sails and silent deck foretelling doom. Known as the Flying Dutchman, it has haunted maritime lore, each sighting blending the real dangers of treacherous seas with a phenomenon that remains unexplained. This story follows Hendrik van der Decken, the captain whose relentless pursuit of speed and profit led to a voyage that vanished into legend. From shipwrecks and naval logs to modern sightings captured on film, you will trace the ghostly ship across centuries, revealing a mystery that lingers on the horizon, where myth and reality converge in the unforgiving ocean. The Phantom on the Horizon. On a clear afternoon of March 23, 1939, Glencairn Beach, just south of Cape Town, seemed to hum with ordinary summer life. Children dug trenches and sculpted sandcastles, couples wandered along the shoreline, and local fishermen readied their boats, checking nets and lines under the bright sun. The sky was cloudless, the water calm, and the distant horizon shimmered with reflected light, giving no hint of the impossibility that was about to unfold. Then, far off the surf, a shape emerged, first a vague shadow, then a structure so precise and deliberate that observers could hardly believe their eyes. It was a ship unlike any living memory held, three-masted, square-rigged, and unmistakably centuries old. The sails hung in shredded strips that somehow remained unfurled, catching wind that was not there. The hull was weathered and rotted, wooden planks warped by time and salt, yet the vessel moved smoothly across the glassy water as if guided by invisible hands. Figures appeared on deck, ghostly and translucent, performing routine tasks in silence. Observers reported a chill that seemed to hang around the ship, a tension that made the air feel heavier, and a sense that time itself had slowed in the ship's presence. Children cried out, some in delight, some in alarm, while adults froze, straining to understand what they saw. Several reached for cameras, but the ship refused to be captured. One professional photographer, J.K. Langley, focused his lens on the apparition, pressing the shutter only as the ship began to dissolve, fading like morning mist under sunlight. Within 30 seconds it had vanished entirely, leaving the beachgoers staring at calm waters and questioning their own senses. Over 60 eyewitnesses reported their experience to the Cape Argus, and the accounts were remarkably uniform. They described the same Dutch merchant vessel, its tattered sails, the silent movement against the wind, and the shadowy crew on deck. Maritime experts confirmed that no ship could have been in that area, and there were no reenactments or film crews that day. Ordinary civilians, seasoned fishermen, and observers, trained in precision and observation, all testified to the same impossible sight, leaving a deep unease among those present. The psychological impact lingered long after the sighting. Witnesses recalled the almost tangible tension, a coldness that seemed to emanate from the ship itself, and a momentary suspension of reality when nothing felt stable or predictable. Families that had been laughing minutes before stood silent, exchanging worried glances as if some unspoken understanding had passed among them. For many, the event left an impression that would last decades. The memory of a ship that should not exist etched into their minds with clarity that science could not explain. Even in calm, ordinary surroundings, the ocean had revealed a glimpse of the extraordinary, a vessel drifting across time and tide with the same spectral presence that had haunted sailors and navigators for centuries. Somewhere off the Cape of Good Hope, a ship lost to history may still glide through the waves, waiting to be seen again. Birth of a legend. Long before witnesses on a South African beach claimed to see an ancient ship drifting silently across modern waters, sailors had already been telling stories about a vessel that could never find its way home. The Flying Dutchman was not born from a single sighting or a single storm, but from centuries of fear carried across the decks of ships that crossed the most dangerous waters on Earth. Long before the name became famous in literature or popular culture, it circulated quietly through maritime communities as a warning passed between crews who had learned that the sea could erase a ship without leaving any trace behind. To understand how such a legend could endure for generations, it is necessary to return to the age when Dutch ships ruled the oceans and the southern seas remained one of the most treacherous frontiers known to European sailors. In the 17th century, the Dutch Republic had become one of the most powerful maritime nations in the world. its prosperity tied directly to the ships that departed daily from bustling ports such as Amsterdam and Rotterdam. This era, now known as the Dutch Golden Age, saw the Netherlands dominate global commerce through a vast network of trade routes stretching across the Atlantic and deep into the Indian Ocean. Merchant fleets carried spices from Southeast Asia, textiles from India, porcelain from China, and countless other goods that transformed European markets and generated enormous wealth for the Republic. Yet every cargo that reached the docks had first survived a journey measured not only in distance but in danger, because the routes connecting Europe to Asia forced sailors to navigate seas that few Europeans had previously charted. At the centre of this global enterprise stood the Dutch East India Company, established in 1602 and granted powers unlike those of any ordinary trading company. Known by its Dutch initials VOC, the organisation was authorised to build fortresses, establish settlements, negotiate treaties, and maintain its own armed fleet to defend its commercial interests abroad. Its ships departed Europe in carefully organised convoys, each one carrying crews who knew that the voyage ahead could last more than a year before they returned home again. The rewards for success were enormous, but the risks were equally immense, because the long passage to Asia forced vessels to sail across waters where storms could appear without warning, and navigation remained an uncertain science. Months at sea exposed crews to dangers that began long before any storm appeared on the horizon. Disease spread easily within the cramped confines of wooden ships, where poor sanitation and limited fresh food often led to outbreaks of scurvy or fever during the long journey. Supplies could spoil, water could run short, and tensions among exhausted sailors sometimes erupted into disputes that threatened the fragile discipline required to keep a ship functioning. Even in calm weather, the voyage demanded constant vigilance, because a single navigational error could drive a vessel onto unseen reefs or leave it stranded far from the trade winds that carried ships across the oceans. Every expedition travelling from Europe toward the East Indies eventually faced the same geographic challenge, rounding the southern tip of Africa. This narrow gateway between oceans formed one of the most critical passages in the global trade network because it allowed ships to move from the Atlantic into the vast waters of the Indian Ocean. The headland known today as the Cape of Good Hope was both a milestone and a test for every captain who commanded a vessel on the eastern trade routes. Passing it successfully meant that the most dangerous stage of the voyage might soon be behind them, but failure often meant that a ship would never be seen again. Generations of navigators came to know this region by a far less hopeful name. When Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias first reached the southern tip of Africa in 1488, the violent weather he encountered led him to call it the Cape of Storms, a title that captured the fear sailors felt when approaching those waters. Powerful winds swept down from the Southern Ocean, colliding with strong currents that surged along the African coastline and created waves capable of overwhelming even large ships. The meeting point between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans produced unpredictable conditions that could shift within hours, turning a calm passage into a chaotic struggle for survival. Historical records reveal just how dangerous the region truly was during the centuries when European maritime trade expanded across the globe. Numerous vessels belonging to Portuguese, Dutch, British and French fleets were lost near the Cape of Good Hope between the 17th and 18th centuries, their wrecks scattered along a coastline that sailors often described as unforgiving. Some ships struck submerged rocks hidden beneath violent surf, while others were driven ashore by storms that tore apart masts and rigging before the crew could react. Even experienced captains could find themselves powerless when confronted by the enormous swells and shifting winds that define the southern seas. Within this environment of constant danger, sailors developed a culture shaped by both practical knowledge and deeply rooted superstition. Crews relied on charts and instruments to guide their journeys, but they also listened carefully to the warnings carried by men who had survived previous voyages. Stories of strange lights appearing above the waves, unexplained shapes moving through distant fog, or phantom sails glimpsed during violent storms became part of the oral traditions shared aboard ships. Such accounts were rarely written down, yet they spread rapidly from crew to crew, gaining new details with every retelling until they became part of the unwritten law of life at sea. Amid these fears and traditions, rumours began to circulate about a Dutch vessel that had suffered a fate worse than shipwreck. According to sailors who repeated the tale in ports across Europe, The ship had attempted to round the Cape during a terrible storm and had never completed the journey. Rather than sinking beneath the waves, it was said to wander endlessly across the oceans, appearing without warning before vanishing again into mist or darkness. No one could say with certainty when the story first emerged, but by the 18th century, the warning of a ghostly Dutch ship had already become familiar to sailors who crossed the southern seas. Before long, those rumours would gather around the name of a single captain whose final voyage would transform a sailor's warning into one of the most enduring legends in maritime history. Hendrik van der Decken, the captain who defied death. Eventually, the warnings whispered among sailors began to revolve around the name of a single Dutch captain whose story would become inseparable from the legend itself. As the tale of a wandering ghost ship spread through ports and across long voyages, the mysterious vessel gradually gained a captain whose defiance seemed to explain its cursed fate. The name most often associated with the legend was Hendrik van der Decken, sometimes written in historical retellings as Van der Decken, a figure who may have been drawn partly from maritime tradition and partly from the imagination of sailors who needed a human cause for the strange stories circulating across the oceans. Over time, his identity became central to the narrative of the Flying Dutchman, transforming a vague warning about a phantom vessel into the story of a captain whose refusal to surrender to nature condemned him and his crew to wander the seas forever. Accounts passed through maritime folklore describe this man as a Dutch captain operating during the Great Age of global trade, a time when the oceans had become highways of commerce connecting Europe to distant continents. Although historians cannot confirm the existence of a specific captain whose life exactly matches the legend, the name Hendrik van der Decken began appearing in literary versions of the story during the 18th and 19th centuries when the Flying Dutchman myth became widely known. These later retellings often presented him as a determined and ambitious commander, one whose pride and stubbornness ultimately led to disaster. Whether such a captain truly sailed under that name or whether the character was created by storytellers, the legend reflects the real pressures faced by those who commanded ships in the dangerous waters of early global trade. Captains serving the Dutch East India Company operated with extraordinary authority, commanding vessels that represented enormous financial investments while carrying crews who depended entirely on their leadership. The Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, maintained one of the largest commercial fleets of its era, sending ships from Europe to Asia in pursuit of spices, textiles, porcelain, and other valuable goods. A single voyage could determine the financial success of an entire trading season, and captains were entrusted with navigating thousands of miles of unfamiliar ocean while protecting cargo worth fortunes back home. This responsibility demanded skill, endurance, and confidence, but it also created an environment in which ambition sometimes pushed captains to make dangerous decisions. Every successful voyage between Europe and the East Indies promised immense rewards for investors and crew alike. Merchants financed expeditions expecting profits that could multiply the value of their original investment many times over, while officers and sailors often received shares of the cargo or bonuses tied to the success of the journey. The faster a ship completed its route and returned with valuable goods, the greater the financial benefit for those involved. In such circumstances, hesitation could mean lost opportunity, and captains who built reputations for bold navigation often gained admiration among merchants eager to see their cargo delivered ahead of competitors. From the crowded harbours of the Dutch Republic, ships loaded with spices, textiles, silver, and trade goods set out on journeys that would carry them across vast stretches of ocean. The departure of a VOC vessel was a carefully organised event, involving hundreds of sailors, carpenters, and dock workers preparing the ship for a voyage that might last more than a year. Supplies of food and fresh water were loaded alongside trade goods, while navigational instruments, maps, and weapons were carefully stored for use during the long expedition. Families and merchants watched from the docks as the ship slowly disappeared beyond the harbour, knowing that many of the men aboard would not return. Weeks at sea gradually reduced the world of the crew to the narrow wooden deck beneath their feet. Life aboard a trading vessel followed a strict rhythm shaped by labour, weather, and the constant movement of the sea. Sailors climbed rigging to adjust sails, repaired damaged ropes and masts, and stood watch during long hours when the horizon revealed nothing but endless water. Conditions were cramped and often harsh, Yet discipline remained essential because even small mistakes could threaten the survival of everyone on board. Within this confined floating community, the captain's authority remained absolute. Decisions about navigation, speed, and safety rested entirely in the hands of one individual, who was expected to maintain order even when storms or exhaustion pushed the crew to their limits. During dangerous situations, there was rarely time for debate, and hesitation could prove fatal if a ship failed to react quickly to sudden changes in wind or current. Sailors might privately question a captain's judgment, but once an order was given, it had to be obeyed without delay. After months of sailing southward along the coast of Africa, ships eventually approached the turbulent waters surrounding the Cape of Good Hope. By the time a vessel reached this point in the journey, the crew had already endured long weeks at sea, yet the most dangerous stage of the voyage still lay ahead. Powerful winds sweeping north from the Southern Ocean collided with strong currents flowing along the African coastline, creating waves capable of smashing ships against hidden rocks or tearing apart their rigging. Captains understood that rounding the Cape required patience and careful navigation, because rushing through the region during bad weather could easily lead to disaster. According to the stories repeated among sailors, it was in these violent waters that the voyage of Hendrik van der Decken reached its turning point. As the legend developed over time, it came to describe a powerful storm rising suddenly near the Cape, trapping the Dutch vessel within enormous waves and relentless winds. The ship struggled against the storm as sailors attempted to control the sails and prevent the vessel from being driven onto the rocks that lined the coast. Lightning flashed across the dark sky while the sea rose in towering swells that threatened to break the ship apart. Rather than retreating from the chaos surrounding the vessel, the captain was said to have insisted on continuing the attempt to round the Cape. In the versions of the story told among sailors, Van der Decken refused to turn back even when his crew urged him to wait for calmer weather. The storm intensified as the ship fought to maintain its course, and each passing moment seemed to bring the vessel closer to destruction. Whether this decision reflected courage, stubbornness, or desperation, the legend portrays the captain as a man unwilling to accept defeat even when nature itself stood in his way. Later retellings of the story transformed this moment into the defining act of the legend. According to maritime folklore, Van der Decken declared that he would complete the passage no matter the cost, even if he were forced to sail until the end of time itself. Such statements appear frequently in sailor traditions, where tales of pride and punishment often served as warnings against arrogance in the face of the sea. Over time, the captain's vow became the central element of the Flying Dutchman myth, representing a challenge not only to the storm but to the forces believed to govern fate and survival on the ocean. What actually became of the ship remains unknown, because no surviving historical record confirms the loss of a vessel commanded by a captain whose story matches the legend in precise detail. Countless ships were wrecked near the Cape of Good Hope during the Great Age of maritime trade, and many disappeared without leaving clear documentation of their final moments. In the absence of certainty, sailors continued to repeat the story of the defiant Dutch captain, gradually transforming an uncertain event into a supernatural warning shared across generations of seafarers. In the centuries that followed, sailors would begin to report that the captain who refused to yield to the storm had never truly left those waters at all. The deadly Cape of Storms. If the legend of the Flying Dutchman is tied to a single place on Earth, it is the stretch of ocean surrounding the southern tip of Africa. For centuries, sailors approaching these waters understood that they were entering one of the most unpredictable regions of the world's oceans, a place where calm seas could transform into violent chaos within hours. Long before the story of a cursed Dutch captain spread through maritime folklore, the waters near the Cape had already gained a reputation for destroying ships that ventured too close. The legend would eventually give those disasters a supernatural explanation, but the fear that inspired the story had very real origins in the geography and climate of this remote corner of the world. At this narrow turning point between two great oceans, ships travelling between Europe and Asia were forced to navigate waters that challenged even the most experienced navigators. During the great age of global trade, vessels carrying spices, silk, porcelain, and precious metals relied on this route to connect European markets with the trading ports of the Indian Ocean and beyond. There were no alternative passages around the southern tip of Africa that offered safety or shelter, and every expedition had to confront the same stretch of water where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans converged. For captains and crews who had already endured months at sea, the Cape represented both a milestone and a formidable test that few approached without caution. When Portuguese navigator Bartolomeu Dias first rounded the southern extremity of Africa in 1488, the experience left a lasting impression on the sailors who followed him. The storms he encountered were so violent that he originally named the region Cabo das Tormentas, or the Cape of Storms, a title that accurately reflected the danger awaiting ships that ventured into those waters. Although the name was later changed to the more optimistic Cape of Good Hope by the Portuguese crown, the original description continued to echo through maritime tradition. Sailors who sailed these routes rarely forgot the reputation of the Cape, because every voyage brought the possibility that a sudden storm could drive a vessel into the rocks or scatter its wreckage across the waves. Here, the powerful Agulhas current flows southward along the eastern coastline of Africa before turning back toward the Indian Ocean, forming one of the strongest ocean currents on the planet. The current carries enormous volumes of warm water at high speed, and when it collides with winds sweeping north from the Southern Ocean, the result can be a sea that behaves with frightening unpredictability. Unlike ordinary swells that roll gently across the open ocean, waves formed by this collision often rise steeply and break with tremendous force. Sailors who encountered these conditions sometimes described the sea as climbing upward rather than moving forward, creating walls of water capable of overwhelming ships built for calmer waters. When strong winds from the southwest strike the opposing current, the ocean's surface can transform into a chaotic landscape of towering waves and violent spray. Modern oceanographers have documented how this interaction can produce unusually steep waves that appear suddenly and strike vessels with little warning. In earlier centuries, when navigational tools were limited and weather forecasting did not exist, ships caught in such conditions had few options beyond enduring the storm and hoping the hull could withstand the punishment. Even large vessels constructed for long-distance voyages could suffer catastrophic damage if struck by repeated waves powerful enough to shatter masts or tear apart rigging. Hidden reefs and jagged rocks along the Cape's coastline created another layer of danger for ships struggling against wind and current. When storms pushed vessels toward the shore, captains often found themselves navigating blindly through mist and darkness, attempting to avoid hazards that could destroy a ship within moments. Charts of the region were incomplete for many decades, and sailors frequently relied on guesswork or experience when determining how close they were to land. A single misjudgment could send a vessel crashing onto submerged rocks, leaving little chance for the crew to escape once the hull began to break apart in the pounding surf. Historical records reveal that many ships were indeed lost along the coast surrounding the Cape of Good Hope during the centuries when European maritime trade expanded across the globe. Portuguese, Dutch, British and French vessels all fell victim to storms in these waters, some leaving behind scattered wreckage while others disappeared without any clear explanation. In certain cases, fragments of cargo or broken timbers washed ashore long after a ship had vanished, providing the only evidence that a vessel had once attempted the passage. These losses were not rare events, but recurring tragedies that reinforced the reputation of the Cape as one of the most dangerous maritime regions in the world. For sailors who survived these voyages, the memory of the Cape often carried an almost supernatural weight. Men who had endured towering waves and relentless winds returned to port with stories that blurred the line between observation and imagination. After weeks of exhaustion and fear, strange shapes glimpsed through mist or distant lights flickering across the horizon could take on meanings that seemed impossible to explain through ordinary experience. It was in this environment, where nature already appeared overwhelming and mysterious, that stories of ghostly ships began to circulate among crews travelling the same perilous route. In storms where visibility vanished and waves rose high enough to obscure the horizon, sailors sometimes believed they saw sails moving through the mist beyond the reach of ordinary vessels. Such sightings might have been distant ships briefly illuminated by lightning or the distorted outlines of rigging glimpsed through sheets of rain. Yet in the minds of sailors already aware of the legend, these fleeting images could easily be interpreted as something far more unsettling. A ship appearing where no ship should be, moving silently through violent weather, seemed to confirm the warnings passed down through generations of seafarers. Stories of phantom vessels gradually spread through maritime communities, merging real dangers with supernatural interpretation. Sailors began to speak of ships that had been lost near the Cape but were still seen wandering through storms, their crews condemned to repeat the final moments of a doomed voyage. Within this tradition, the Flying Dutchman emerged as the most famous of these spectral warnings, a symbol of the countless vessels that had attempted the passage and never returned. The legend explained the disappearances that the sea itself refused to reveal, and in a place where storms erase ships without leaving witnesses behind, the idea of a vessel condemned to sail forever no longer seemed impossible. The first disappearances and apparitions. The Cape's waters had claimed countless ships before sailors even whispered of the spectral vessel that would haunt them for centuries. The seas around the Cape of Good Hope were notoriously treacherous, where currents collided and storms could rise with little warning, swallowing ships whole. But in the late 17th century, something else began to take shape in sailors' tales. A ship that should not have been there, a vessel that appeared with uncanny consistency, sailing against wind and reason. Even the most experienced captains began to note that these sightings were not random, often coinciding with specific maritime hazards: shallow reefs, shifting sandbanks, and sudden gusts that had claimed lives for generations. Entire crews vanished without a trace, their ships swallowed by the sea, leaving nothing but empty waves and unanswered questions. One of the earliest documented losses involved a Dutch East India Company vessel departing the Cape for Batavia in 1680. When it failed to arrive, investigators could find no wreckage, no survivors, and no sign of what might have befallen the crew. Within months, another ship rounding the Cape reported a strange silhouette on the horizon, a ship remarkably similar to the missing vessel, its sails tattered yet fully set, moving silently across the water. Mariners noted the uncanny resemblance between each phantom and the vessel it seemed to replace, reinforcing a belief that something unnatural was at play. Word of strange occurrences began to circulate quietly among sailors, growing with each retelling, shifting from rumour into uneasy expectation. Whispers spread through taverns and ports, carried along the busy maritime routes of the Dutch Golden Age, where news of lost ships and ghostly sightings travelled as quickly as spices or silk. Veteran mariners began advising new captains to keep a wary eye on the horizon, especially during the violent months when storms were common, and the waters of the Cape showed their most merciless side. It became an unspoken rule: to encounter the phantom ship was to invite danger, and avoidance was often the only course recommended by those with years at sea. The first accounts of an impossible ship often came from night watches, when exhausted crews glimpsed a rigging that seemed centuries out of date. Officers reported seeing vessels with square-rigged masts and designs long abandoned, appearing fully formed despite having disappeared months earlier. Shadows moved on deck, human yet ghostly, as if the crew of the ship was trapped in some suspended moment, repeating the voyage they could never complete. These accounts were recorded in personal journals and occasionally in official logs, creating an early historical record of the Flying Dutchman's eerie presence. Some even mentioned fleeting glimpses of lantern light on deck, though no fire or signal could have survived so long at sea without tending. Witnesses described a vessel with sails shredded as if by 100 storms, gliding across waters that were otherwise calm and unbroken. Its hull often appeared damaged, as if repeatedly dashed against unseen rocks, yet the ship floated effortlessly, defying physics and reason. Crew members watching from nearby ships noted the absence of sound: no creaking wood, no slapping of waves against the hull, not even the whistle of wind in the rigging. The stillness was so pronounced it became part of the terror, an unnatural silence that suggested the living world had no hold over this apparition. Some accounts even suggested a faint, briny scent of decay, so subtle it unsettled sailors without explanation. Many of these sightings occurred during tempests, where wind and rain could conceal illusions, yet the clarity of the ship unnerved those who claimed to see it. Even in the midst of storms that could tear smaller vessels apart, the phantom ship appeared fully formed and resolute, gliding as if guided by some unearthly force. Some sailors reported that the apparition seemed to move with intent, altering its course in response to their own, appearing almost sentient, a harbinger whose presence portended misfortune or death. In journals, captains carefully noted how the timing of these appearances often aligned with moments when miscalculations could prove fatal. Sailors began to speak of the ghost ship as a portent, a harbinger of doom whose approach often preceded shipwrecks or sudden death. One account tells of a Dutch vessel that sighted the phantom ship 3 months after Van der Decken's disappearance, only to sink days later in calm waters, leaving half the crew dead without explanation. Reports like this imbued the legend with a deadly aura, establishing a pattern in which encounters were rarely neutral. The ghostly vessel was no mere illusion, it became a symbol of inevitable peril. Over time, captains advised that a sighting demanded respect, avoidance, and silent observation rather than bravado or pursuit. Stories travelled along trade routes as reliably as the cargo itself, carried from Amsterdam to Batavia, from Lisbon to the Cape, embedding the tale in maritime culture. Officers passing through ports would swap accounts, each sighting reinforcing the next, and over time the Flying Dutchman became an accepted, if horrifying, part of nautical lore. From sailors' letters to official naval documents, the apparition was consistently described in meticulous detail: sails torn, rigging frayed, a ghostly crew whose expressions seemed frozen in fury and despair. Some chroniclers noted how these tales blended with local legends of shipwrecks, creating a persistent narrative that crossed national and linguistic boundaries. By the late 18th century, the legend had begun to appear in early printed references and maritime journals, capturing the imagination of those who never sailed near the Cape. Illustrations depicted a ship sailing against impossible odds, enveloped in mist, a reminder of both the perilous nature of the Cape and the enduring mystery that had emerged from it. The consistency of reports, across decades and among witnesses of different nations, lent credibility to a story that might otherwise have been dismissed as superstition or maritime exaggeration. Even in distant ports where no Dutch vessels ever arrived, the Flying Dutchman's tale was known and recounted with the same awe and fear. Despite growing awareness, no explanation could fully account for the consistency of reports or the uncanny resemblance of each apparition to the last. Scholars and navigators proposed optical illusions, mirages, or hallucinations, yet each hypothesis struggled to explain the repeated, highly detailed observations that matched accounts from centuries apart. Ordinary sailors and naval officers alike testified to seeing the same ship in nearly identical conditions, suggesting a phenomenon that transcended ordinary perception, one that seemed to anchor itself to the memory of the Cape itself. As the centuries passed, sailors would continue to report seeing a battered ship emerging from storms where no vessel should have survived, a silent witness to vanished crews and maritime hubris, forever tied to the shadowed waters of the Cape. Encounters that shook sailors. Mist hung over the southern horizon when the first watchman reported a ship moving against the wind, its presence so impossible that disbelief was the immediate reaction. Crews on passing merchant vessels squinted through the grey veil of dawn, certain at first that exhaustion or the play of light was responsible, yet the outline of a ship, tattered sails and a rigid hull, could not be ignored. In the quiet that followed, the officers noted with unease that the apparition appeared deliberately, holding a position on the horizon as though aware of the human eyes trained upon it. Many recalled that the colours of the ship seemed muted, a ghostly grey that blended with the fog, lending it the air of a vessel half erased from the world of the living. On storm-lashed nights, sailors claimed to see the Flying Dutchman emerge from sheets of rain, cutting through the waves as if guided by some unearthly hand. Torrential downpours and sudden squalls concealed familiar landmarks, yet the phantom ship remained clearly defined, its square-rigged masts and frayed rigging visible even through the thick curtain of weather. Witnesses often recalled a sudden chill and an unnatural hush that fell across the deck, as though the air itself was warning of the vessel's presence. In several instances, the cold was so intense that ropes stiffened and metal fittings on ships froze, creating a tactile evidence of the apparition's intrusion into the natural world. Silence enveloped the phantom vessel, a stillness so profound that nearby crews felt as though the world itself had stopped to watch. No creaking timbers, no slap of waves against the hull, and not even the whistle of wind in the rigging accompanied its approach. The absence of sound became a defining feature of every sighting, a detail that was repeated with unnerving precision across decades and different observers, suggesting that this was no ordinary ship adrift on open water. Some sailors compared the silence to the calm that precedes a storm, yet no storm followed immediately, heightening the sense that the ship existed on a plane outside natural order. Naval logs from different nations repeatedly recorded the same phenomenon, a spectral ship appearing with precise timing before deadly storms struck. In 1840, a British frigate logged a sighting off the Cape of Good Hope, noting the uncanny correlation between the apparition and a sudden violent gale that followed within hours. Portuguese and Dutch captains told similar stories, their written accounts confirming not only the ship's appearance, but also its recurring association with maritime disaster. Scholars studying these logs noted patterns in wind direction, lunar cycles, and tidal currents, yet the ghost ship's appearances remained inconsistent enough to defy meteorological explanation. The HMS Bacante crew's 1881 encounter remains one of the most detailed, with every officer noting the vessel's impossible manoeuvring and ghostly appearance. Captain Sir George Grey described the ship as an ancient vessel yet intact, moving against the wind with an unnatural serenity, while midshipmen recorded the frightened reactions of ordinary sailors who felt powerless before what they swore was a cursed presence. This account was later cross-referenced with sightings by nearby merchant ships, revealing a pattern of consistent descriptions from multiple vantage points. Remarkably, the crew noted subtle details such as barnacle growth and wear along the hull that matched ships lost in the region decades prior, as if the Flying Dutchman bore the physical scars of its doomed predecessors. Ragged sails flapped without wind, and the hull showed scars from imagined collisions, yet the ship floated with an eerie permanence that defied explanation. Observers remarked on the uniformity of its damage, noting that it resembled vessels lost decades earlier, as if the ship carried the marks of its doomed history wherever it sailed. Nautical historians later cross-referenced these descriptions, with records of Dutch East India Company losses, finding parallels in mast design, hull dimensions, and rigging that lent the sightings a chilling plausibility. These details became signatures, anchoring the legend in reality and giving each new sighting a haunting familiarity. Smaller coastal vessels reported sightings that often coincided with sudden squalls, as if the ghost ship's approach summoned danger rather than merely predicting it. Fishermen and harbour pilots described flashes of rigging seen through sheets of rain, followed by violent gusts or lightning strikes that made them wary of leaving port. Some considered the apparition a curse, others a warning. Independent observers recorded phenomena such as erratic compass readings and sudden drops in temperature at the moment the ship appeared, hinting at a tangible physical effect beyond mere optical illusion. Regardless, its presence invariably stirred fear and superstition, leaving crews on edge long before the first waves hit. Shadows on the phantom deck were described as figures frozen mid-motion, caught in a limbo that blurred the line between life and death. Sailors swore they saw men working ropes, shouting commands, or staring silently over the bow, only to vanish when approached. These spectral crew members were often dressed in archaic Dutch uniforms, reinforcing the idea that the ship was an echo of Vanderdecken's doomed expedition, forever repeating its fateful voyage. Some accounts even described brief flashes of lantern light or the glint of brass fittings, which disappeared before observers could focus, suggesting a temporal layer to the apparition. Mariners from across Europe and Asia independently recounted nearly identical encounters, the uncanny consistency lending the story an unsettling credibility. Letters and journals from Lisbon, Amsterdam, Batavia, and Calcutta contained remarkably similar descriptions, detailing torn sails, silent decks, and a ship that seemed impervious to both storm and time. Scholars noted the repetition of these accounts over centuries, a testament to a phenomenon that resisted rational explanation. Cartographers occasionally marked these sightings on nautical charts, creating a spectral map of the ship's appearance along major trade routes, as though the Flying Dutchman had a deliberate path. Patterns emerged over decades. The apparition would appear, linger briefly, and vanish, almost as though it measured its impact on those who saw it. Some sailors claimed that the ship seemed to watch them, following their course for hours before disappearing beyond the horizon. Others noted that the sea appeared to react in subtle ways, waves swelling without wind, mists coiling unnaturally around the ship. Phenomena recorded across multiple logbooks. Each encounter reinforced a growing belief that the Flying Dutchman was not merely a myth, but a spectral entity with purpose and perhaps even awareness. Tales of the ghost ship travelled faster than any merchant convoy, carried in letters, journals, and whispered warnings from harbour to harbour. Port authorities, aware of the growing legend, sometimes attempted to verify sightings, yet each effort yielded the same eerie reports: a ship defying wind, tide, and logic, appearing suddenly where none should be. The consistency of these accounts cemented the Flying Dutchman in maritime culture, instilling fear and awe in those whose lives depended on the sea. In some harbours, crews refused to sail during months historically associated with sightings, demonstrating how deeply superstition and recorded encounters had merged. Officers trained to record every detail found themselves at a loss, their precise notes confirming what they feared most: that the Flying Dutchman was more than legend. Scientific observers proposed mirages or optical illusions, yet the repeated, highly detailed reports, corroborated across continents and decades, resisted such simple explanations. For sailors, it was not a matter of belief but of survival. Recognizing the ghost ship could mean preparing for disaster, while ignoring it invited catastrophe. Over time, the pattern of sightings and associated mishaps became a study in maritime caution, blending the psychological and the inexplicable into a lived reality on the sea. Through repeated sightings, the ship's ominous reputation solidified, leaving sailors with an enduring impression of dread long before the first waves broke against their own hulls. Its presence became an unavoidable part of navigating the Cape and beyond, a legend reinforced by each new observer unlucky enough to glimpse it firsthand. The spectral vessel existed at the edge of perception, a reminder that the ocean could still harbour mysteries that resisted measurement, charting, or prediction, and that some dangers remained utterly beyond human comprehension. Even as centuries passed, the Flying Dutchman remained a harbinger that could appear at any moment, its sudden arrival marking the thin boundary between the known world and the inexplicable. Modern sightings and photographic evidence. New technologies of the 20th century brought the Flying Dutchman into sharper focus, as photographers and researchers began documenting the seas near the Cape of Good Hope and beyond, capturing shapes that defied conventional explanation. Cameras mounted on ships or handheld by shore observers occasionally produced images that, upon inspection, seemed to reveal the unmistakable outline of an aged vessel gliding across open water. These photographs, though grainy and sometimes questioned for accuracy, corresponded with centuries-old descriptions: square-rigged masts, tattered sails, and decks that appeared frozen in time. For historians and enthusiasts alike, the photographs offered a rare chance to see a legend once confined to maritime journals, personal logs, and whispered tales, now rendered visible in the modern age. Beachgoers along remote South African coasts reported strange vessels appearing just beyond the breakers, often described as antique ships moving silently, their sails torn yet fully set, visible even in the glare of sunlight reflecting off the water. Lifeguards and tourists alike spoke of the eerie sensation of watching a ship hover impossibly above the waves, its presence commanding attention yet resisting explanation. Children playing in tidal pools recalled fleeting glimpses of figures on the deck, seemingly caught in mid-motion, only to disappear moments later. These incidents, though sporadic, became more than isolated reports, forming a modern tapestry of encounters that echoed the warnings and accounts of centuries past. In 1939, a series of photographs taken near Simonstown showed an unmistakable ship on the horizon, its form matching centuries-old descriptions of the Flying Dutchman, prompting debate in maritime circles about whether such images could be optical illusions or evidence of a persistent phenomenon. Published in local newspapers and examined by naval officers, the photos revealed a hull with irregularities and a mast structure incongruent with contemporary vessels. The images coincided with eyewitness testimony from nearby fishermen, who described a sudden hush and a chilling stillness that accompanied the ship's appearance, a signature characteristic reported since the 17th century. Researchers in the late 20th century compiled dozens of eyewitness reports from sailors, fishermen, and naval personnel, noting consistent details: square-rigged masts, frayed sails, silent decks, and a presence that seemed to move deliberately in relation to human observers. Some accounts described crews watching in disbelief as the ghost ship mirrored their own course for hours before vanishing, leaving no wake or indication of propulsion. The uniformity of these reports, spanning decades and hundreds of miles, reinforced the notion that this was no ordinary misperception, but a recurring phenomenon that continued to challenge rational explanation. Modern sailors recounted encounters during unusually calm or stormy conditions alike, emphasizing that the apparition seemed impervious to weather, its appearance sometimes immediately preceding sudden squalls or equipment failures on board. Instruments would falter, compasses spun erratically, and electronics briefly failed, further fueling the perception that the ship exerted an unearthly influence on its surroundings. Veterans of the sea described an unmistakable aura of foreboding, a sense that the vessel's presence was both a warning and a test of resolve, a continuation of the ominous legacy established by Van der Decken centuries before. Amateur and professional photographers alike reported capturing images that defied explanation, with long exposures revealing ghostly outlines that vanished upon review, reinforcing the eerie pattern that had persisted since the 17th century. Some photographers noted streaks of light or shadow that seemed to outline the ship's form before it fully emerged from the mist, as if the apparition phased in and out of perception. Such evidence, while inconclusive to skeptics, provided compelling documentation for those who believed that the Flying Dutchman's legend had not only survived, but also adapted to a new era of observation. Even in heavily trafficked shipping lanes, the ghost ship appeared to select its moments, often appearing to vessels at dawn or dusk, when light conditions could distort perception, yet consistently aligning with traditional descriptions from historical accounts. Sailors navigating the same waters where Dutch and British vessels had disappeared centuries earlier reported feelings of dread and a heightened awareness of the horizon. Photographs and testimonies often coincided with these fleeting appearances, creating a layered record of visual and experiential evidence that lent the legend a renewed credibility. Skeptics suggested lens flares, mirages, or atmospheric phenomena could account for some sightings, but repeated patterns and corroboration from multiple independent observers strengthened the argument that a genuine, unexplainable phenomenon persisted into modern times. Even with advancements in meteorology and optical science, certain conditions seemed to produce effects that could not fully explain the detailed and consistent descriptions provided by professional mariners and casual observers alike. Each sighting reinforced the pattern. The Flying Dutchman remained a spectral entity whose behaviour continued to confound explanation. Documented encounters extended beyond South African waters, with reports from the Indian Ocean and occasional sightings in the Atlantic hinting at a broader range than previously believed, suggesting the legend's spectral presence may follow historic maritime routes. Cruise ships, naval vessels, and private yachts all contributed to a growing body of modern sightings, each adding a thread to the narrative of a ship that transcended time, geography, and human expectation. Each new photographic or eyewitness account rekindled fascination among historians and mariners alike, reinforcing the Flying Dutchman's place not only in folklore but also in ongoing investigation, where empirical observation and mystery coexist uneasily. For those who had glimpsed it, the vessel was no longer merely a story of the past, but a tangible, haunting presence that reminded them that some legends persist not only in memory, but also in the very waters they traverse. Even in an age of satellites and instant communication, the Flying Dutchman continued to materialize on horizons where it should not exist, leaving modern observers to question whether some mysteries of the sea are timeless and beyond human control. Theories behind the ghost ship. Modern cameras and eyewitness reports continue to capture fleeting images of the Flying Dutchman, raising a persistent question. Were these witnesses seeing a centuries-old phantom or something more explainable? Even with advanced optics and high-resolution lenses, photographs often revealed only a hazy silhouette, a ship suspended on the water as though caught between reality and imagination. Researchers and enthusiasts debated these images, comparing them to historical accounts, and noted that the vessel's characteristic tattered sails, square-rigged masts, and silent deck persisted across decades and continents, appearing under circumstances that no ordinary ship could have survived. Some reports even described the ghostly vessel seemingly altering course in tandem with nearby ships, reinforcing its reputation for deliberate, uncanny behaviour. Above the shimmering waves, atmospheric distortions occasionally bend light in ways that can conjure distant ships where none exist, a trick of temperature and reflection known to mariners as fata morgana. Superior mirages occur when layers of air at different temperatures bend light, creating illusions of objects on the horizon. In some documented cases, ships that had already sunk or remained far out to sea appeared to loom impossibly close, their outlines sharp enough to confuse even experienced sailors. Yet these phenomena could not entirely account for the uniformity of reports spanning centuries, where observers described identical features in ships that should have been lost to time, appearing under varying light, weather, and distance conditions. On certain nights, the ocean itself seemed alive, with glowing microorganisms or strange light refractions casting shapes that flickered like phantom vessels on the horizon. Bioluminescent plankton can create long, undulating streaks of light across waves, and moonlight or distant lighthouses can accentuate these glimmers. In combination, these conditions could produce moving illusions that mimic masts, rigging, or the reflection of a hull. Some scientists suggest that sightings in calm waters may have been intensified by such environmental effects, particularly when observers were already primed by legends and prior stories. Still, the sightings frequently involved multiple witnesses, simultaneous observations from different angles, or photographic evidence that challenges simple optical explanations, including instances where professional maritime photographers captured more than one image in succession, showing the vessel in slightly shifted positions as if moving with intent. Shallow reefs and hidden wrecks have long surprised navigators, their half-submerged remains sometimes glimpsed only fleetingly, stirring wonder and dread in those who thought the waters empty. The Cape of Good Hope and surrounding shipping lanes are littered with centuries-old wrecks from Dutch, Portuguese, and British vessels, and tides or storms can reveal fragments just above the waterline. Witnesses have reported seeing entire hulls and masts emerge, as if the sea itself were resurfacing long-lost ships. Yet these encounters often occurred far from known wreck sites, in open waters where no charts indicated submerged hazards, leaving investigators uncertain whether a natural explanation was sufficient. Some mariners even noted that the ghostly ship appeared in locations where no known wreck could exist, further complicating the picture for oceanographers and historians alike. Endless watches, storm-lashed nights, and the ceaseless horizon can warp perception, and the minds of fatigued sailors sometimes assemble fragments of reality into coherent yet impossible forms. Sleep deprivation, isolation, and the rhythmic motion of the ocean have long been understood to affect cognition, producing hallucinations or vivid illusions. Psychologists studying maritime folklore note that repeated exposure to stories of the Flying Dutchman could prime observers to interpret ambiguous shapes or shadows as a ghostly ship. However, accounts spanning centuries show remarkable consistency, with officers and sailors describing the same vessel, its silent crew, and its tattered rigging in detail that surpasses what simple imagination might produce. Some contemporary studies even highlight the role of collective expectation, showing how groups of trained seafarers independently report identical anomalies when aware of the legend, suggesting a powerful intersection of perception, memory, and anticipation. The meticulous uniformity of eyewitness descriptions, from rigging and sails to silent crews, continues to challenge every attempt to reduce the phenomenon to mere illusion. Reports often include identical measurements of the ship's masts, the spacing of deck structures, and the absence of sound, even under conditions where wind and waves should have been audible. Cross-referenced logbooks and letters reveal that sightings were recorded by independent observers who were unaware of one another's reports, yet the details match with uncanny precision. In several 20th-century cases, amateur and professional photographers captured the ship from angles hundreds of meters apart, with consistent features corroborating historical accounts. Some historians and marine scholars argue that this level of consistency cannot be explained solely by mirages, hallucinations, or folklore, suggesting that a genuine unexplained phenomenon persists on the waters. Each proposed theory illuminates a part of the mystery, yet the Flying Dutchman remains a puzzle that bridges the natural and the inexplicable, resisting any single explanation entirely. Superior mirages account for distant illusions, bioluminescence offers fleeting shapes, wrecks provide sporadic appearances, and psychology explains perceptual errors. But none of these theories encompasses the ship's centuries-long presence, its repeated appearance before storms or disasters, or the detailed descriptions that link sightings across oceans and generations. Modern imaging technology, despite its clarity and precision, has only reinforced the enigma, capturing the spectral vessel in ways that hint at motion, intent, and continuity that elude conventional science. No matter how closely science scrutinizes the horizon, the ghost ship endures, a spectral witness to the limits of human understanding and the secrets of the sea, its presence still stirring awe and unease in every generation of observers. A curse etched in history. Centuries of sightings point back to a single moment when human ambition collided with the sea, a captain whose choices would haunt generations of sailors. Hendrik van der Decken was not a man content with ordinary achievement. He pursued speed and profit with a precision that bordered on obsession, meticulously charting routes and monitoring tides in a way that few contemporaries could rival. His reputation for pushing ships and crews to their limits was well known among Dutch mariners, a mixture of respect and fear passing between officers as they prepared to sail under his command, with many noting that his demands often left men physically and mentally exhausted, even before the Cape loomed on the horizon. Hendrik van der Decken's relentless drive to outpace rival East India Company vessels defined his career, yet it came at a cost. Crew members, already wary of the Cape's treacherous waters, often voiced concern about navigating narrow currents and storm-prone channels in pursuit of faster delivery. Letters from contemporaries hint at whispered warnings, cautioning that such determination might invite catastrophe, a warning that history would prove all too accurate. Some logs describe sailors praying silently at dawn, crossing themselves as they watch the captain scrutinize wind shifts and calculate tidal changes with relentless precision. The captain's obsession was not merely with speed, it extended to wealth, prestige, and leaving a mark on maritime history, each decision reflecting a calculated risk, balanced precariously against human limitation. In 1678, Van der Decken departed Amsterdam with a vessel laden with spices, textiles, and precious metals, its hold a testament to the riches that fueled his ambition. Every element of the voyage had been planned to outmaneuver competitors, from the timing of departures to the selection of crew who could endure the grueling pace demanded of them. Early in the journey, officers noted the captain's meticulous attention to navigation charts and the constant adjustment of sails to exploit even minor wind shifts. The vessel's rigging and spars were reinforced beyond standard practice, yet some mariners murmured that no matter the preparation, the forces of wind and sea might not yield to human will. Logs and surviving letters document growing tension among the crew as the ship neared the Cape of Good Hope. Sailors remarked on sudden, unseasonable squalls, glimpses of waves that seemed higher and darker than charts suggested, and the quiet apprehension of men who had seen the Cape's waters claim countless vessels. Van der Decken's insistence on pressing forward through storm warnings amplified unease, his decisions heightening the sense that the voyage carried more than ordinary risk, as though the sea itself had become a silent observer, ready to respond to defiance. Some officers recorded restless nights, the constant rocking and the roar of distant waves leaving men half asleep, half dreadful, as if the ocean itself were testing their endurance. When the ship reached the notorious Cape, violent gales struck without warning. Accounts from other vessels in the region recorded the storm's ferocity, yet Van der Decken's ship disappeared entirely, leaving no debris or survivors behind. Investigators combed the coastlines, questioned returning crews and searched shipping records, but nothing could explain the vessel's sudden erasure. The sudden vanishing, so complete that even lifeboats or flotsam were never found, was unlike any ordinary maritime disaster, and it fueled speculation that something beyond human comprehension was at work. In its absence, rumour quickly filled the void, linking the disappearance to the captain's relentless pursuit of speed and the dangerous waters he'd chosen to challenge. Within months, whispers spread of a spectral ship glimpsed by sailors navigating the Cape, a vessel that bore an uncanny resemblance to Van der Decken's lost ship. Reports described tattered sails, square-rigged masts, and an eerie silence on the deck, details that mirrored the ship's final preparations before the storm. Mariners spoke of a presence that seemed aware of their movements, appearing when least expected and vanishing with equal abruptness. Some letters mentioned sailors being unable to sleep after sightings, claiming the phantom vessel haunted their dreams and conversations in port taverns, as if the ghost ship had a psychological hold on those who encountered it. Over time, these accounts transformed from rumour into legend, the Flying Dutchman becoming a cautionary emblem for those who dared to defy the sea. Maritime culture absorbed the tale quickly, Journals, letters, and early printed accounts preserved these sightings, framing the ghost ship not as entertainment, but as a dire warning. Stories circulated in Dutch, Portuguese, and British ports alike, ensuring that the cautionary tale of Van der Decken's doomed ambition reached sailors before they even approached the Cape. Port captains occasionally issued informal warnings, advising mariners to keep a vigilant eye and to respect the currents and storms that had claimed so many before. The legend's endurance lay in its moral clarity. Human obsession, unchecked by prudence or respect for natural forces, could invite consequences beyond imagination, visible even across centuries. Accounts of vanished crews, lost cargo, and phantom appearances reinforced a pattern that seafarers could not ignore. Scholars studying maritime history note that the uniformity of descriptions, from rigging and sails to silent decks and frozen crew figures, lends an unnerving credibility to these reports. Some observers recorded minute details, such as the unusual spacing of deck beams or the precise folding of sails, which matched earlier written accounts. The Flying Dutchman, born from a single voyage gone awry, became a symbol etched in nautical consciousness, an enduring testament to the peril of ambition when pitted against the unpredictable forces of nature. The human cost of Van der Decken's obsession is impossible to quantify, but it is visible in every tale of vanished sailors, every account of terror at sea, and in the lingering fear that has haunted mariners for centuries. Stories passed down through logs, journals, and oral accounts suggest that the curse was not merely his alone, but one that clung to the waters he once sought to conquer. Even as technology and navigation improved, the legend persisted, entwined with real dangers of the Cape, from hidden reefs to sudden squalls, and cementing the Flying Dutchman as a symbol of maritime horror rather than simple folklore. The story of Van der Decken's curse lingers on the horizon, a spectral warning that continues to shadow every seafaring voyage. The unsolved mystery. Long after Van der Decken vanished, the sea seemed to guard its secret, allowing glimpses of a ship that no map or record could explain. Generations of sailors have described tattered sails, square-rigged masts, and a deck that remains unnervingly silent, emerging suddenly from fog or storm and disappearing without a trace. Despite the centuries that have passed, the consistency of these accounts, the ship's appearance, its unchanging design, the uncanny presence of ghostly crew, resists conventional explanation, leaving historians, navigators, and maritime enthusiasts grappling with a phenomenon that refuses to yield its truth. Reports spanning continents and centuries provide a striking consistency, yet the evidence stubbornly refuses to converge on a definitive answer. Dutch East India Company logs, British naval journals, and letters from Cape merchants all recount sightings in remarkably similar detail, from the layout of the decks to the exact angles of rigging torn by imagined storms. Even modern accounts captured in photographs or corroborated by multiple witnesses mirror descriptions from the 17th and 18th centuries, suggesting that the phenomenon persists across both time and technology. The sheer breadth of reports adds weight to the mystery, but simultaneously underscores the absence of an explanation that can satisfy both science and history. Oceanographers and meteorologists have catalogued every storm, mirage, and luminous phenomenon, but none fully reproduce the ship's persistent form and behaviour. Superior mirages, Fata Morgana effects, and bioluminescent glimmers have been proposed as partial explanations, yet none account for the detailed, repeated sightings in open waters, nor for the vessel's apparent autonomy, appearing to manoeuvre deliberately, sometimes following observers for hours. Scientific models can replicate isolated visual anomalies, but the Flying Dutchman's endurance as a recurring, centuries-spanning phenomenon remains beyond the scope of naturalistic reasoning, leaving experts to confront the limits of observation on turbulent seas. Mariners under strain and isolation often perceive anomalies, yet these human limitations cannot account for decades of independent, detailed observations. Officers on multiple ships, often unaware of each other's accounts, describe the same elements: ghostly crew frozen in motion, a hull battered yet unsinkable, sails that flap without wind. Psychologists note that sleep deprivation and ocean-induced vertigo can create illusions, but the precision and repetition of these reports challenge purely psychological interpretations. When corroborated across time zones and nationalities, the sightings suggest a consistency that exceeds mere cognitive error, pointing toward a mystery embedded in the very waters themselves. The vessel seems to inhabit a borderland between reality and imagination, appearing and disappearing as though the world itself hesitates to claim it. Witnesses speak of moments when waves calm unnaturally, when the wind dies, and the apparition drifts silently into view, a presence both physical and spectral. Observers report a sensation of being watched, as if the ship recognizes human scrutiny, responding subtly yet deliberately to those who gaze upon it. In these instances, the boundary between tangible and intangible blurs, reinforcing the ship's status as a liminal entity, neither entirely real nor fully imagined, forever poised on the edge of perception. Even in modern harbours, fleeting silhouettes are reported, images captured in photographs, brief glimpses on stormy nights, reminders that the legend refuses to fade. Maritime researchers have catalogued dozens of such encounters, from beachgoers along South African coasts to naval officers navigating trade routes in Asia. Despite high-resolution cameras and satellite imaging, the Flying Dutchman often appears only partially, as a shadow or outline, defying full capture. Each instance reaffirms that the mystery is not confined to folklore, but continues to provoke fear, curiosity, and scholarly debate in contemporary maritime circles. The Flying Dutchman drifts perpetually at the edge of certainty, a spectral riddle that lingers beyond explanation and beyond time itself. No theory, optical, psychological, or environmental, has succeeded in fully accounting for the ship's repeated appearances, its detailed and consistent form, or the eerie awareness reported by those who encounter it. The legend endures precisely because it resists closure, a haunting reminder that some corners of the world remain beyond human understanding, and that the horizon can still harbour enigmas that neither maps nor science can tame. The mystery of the Flying Dutchman persists, a ghostly presence that continues to haunt every horizon it crosses,